Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and today I have my very special guest, Chino Ross, pastor and teacher. Chino, so good to have you back. We had one single episode on Hobart Freeman, and we started receiving all kinds of mail wanting more. In fact, I just interviewed a guy yesterday for the testimonies that we do every Friday, and he was explaining his life and how much it impacted, and in a negative way, impacted his life and broke up his family, and so many things that it's a horrible story. I won't tell it here. You can go listen to it on the testimonies when they play on the Fridays, but it is very disturbing, and it reminds me so much of what I hear coming out of the William Branham sect, because this essentially was just a clone of Branham's message cult following under a different name. And I was surprised. I think the biggest surprise I got was from you towards the end of the episode last time. We were talking about when Branham died. That's whenever Hobart Freeman was contacted, and it looks like there was this shift for him to be the new Branham.
I think you and I would probably agree, John, that it's not specific to Hobart Freeman or to William Branham how these cults operate. But I've always been amazed. You have a big background with the message. And as I shared with you in our first interview, when I was 17 years old, I was first introduced to Dr. Freeman's teaching. And for point of reference, I'm 65 years old today. So I have been in and around Hobart Freeman's teaching, I have to say, for all my life, most of my life. Now, I never attended, I never was a member, I never moved to Indiana, but I was aware of the teaching and closely followed it, believed it the first couple of years in my teens. And then, as I explained in our previous discussion together, I gravitated away from it, but I just knew so many people who were a part of it, like you, with people who come from the message. And of course, people nowadays, you can get online, and there are some online places people can find. One of them may be called Overcomers Online or something, but there are a few of them. If you'll just, and people are good at this, digging in and researching Hobart Freeman and Faith Assembly. And to your point about the person you recently interviewed, you can go, it's just message after message, paragraph after paragraph. Probably, I would guess the one I'm thinking of, 80% negative, 20%, oh, he was God's man, all of you people just misunderstood. He never said that. And you took it out of context, and, all of that spin that they put on it. But most of the people tell some terribly tragic stories. Thankfully, I don't have any kind of story like that to tell. I was only closely associated with it for the last of my teenage years and then into my early 20s, and I quickly gravitated away from it. Although, it always held its allure. And as I explained in our previous interview, I think a lot of the allure was that Hobart Freeman did have a doctor's degree in Old Testament and Hebrew. So he was not one of these, just raised in a Kentucky holler somewhere and came out spinning his tales on Bible prophecy. He had a great, great foundation for the most part in normal Orthodox evangelical theology. And that made him, in my mind, and I think in other people's minds, a little bit different than the tried and true, who were more like, the Elmer Gantrys in the old movie. I mean, they were just selling snake oil is what they were really doing. And Hobart would actually teach from the Bible and teach some good theology stuff. And that, of course, wasn't the problem. The problem was when he began to teach Branham doctrine, when he began to teach manifested sons, matured sons of God, former rain, latter rain. When he got off on that, it's just like, where's good scriptural proof and context for this? And it's just something that we couldn't find.
I have a difficult job because I record these podcasts and I schedule them ahead of time. And I've got different flavors of the podcast running. I'll never combine it in such a way where it's cohesive and coherent, but I've got one podcast trail that's running that is talking about the man-child, the manifest sons of God, where it came from, Christian identity. Actually, you can trace its origins all the way back to Jane Lead. So I've got that going in the Converging Apostasy series. I've got, as I mentioned, the guy who is in the Hobart Freeman sect, and just horrific stories. He told me that he had problem with his arm and it turned gangrenous, and they told him he couldn't take any medicine for it. And
absolutely,
it's horrific. He said, fortunately, it drained and he survived. Anyway, I've got that going in another one, and then in our Weaponized Religion series, we may have identified where William Branham went to school. As I mentioned,
really?
In our last episode, we talked about how none of his life story is true, not a single stitch of it. But I don't think I went this deep. He tells this tale of how he was poor and destitute, which that part was probably true. But then all of a sudden, what he doesn't say is he runs into all kinds of money. He's suddenly at age 16 buying new vehicles. I mean, it's really insane when you think of what's happening. And then he says he goes immediately after buying this brand new Ford. He drives out to Phoenix, Arizona, and he gives the location. And what he's describing, you picture from an old Western movie, some old ranch where he's bucking broncos. And well, no, man, the location that he gives is right down, and you can see I can't remember the name of the building, but it was just being constructed, like 10 stories high building right out of his back window. That's where this would have been. Well, there's a consistency flaw. His brother killed a man. His whole family was in the mob, it looks like. His brother killed a man. And in the obituary, it says William Branham from Kansas, not from Phoenix. And
wow,
we have identified, it looks very much, we can place Roy Davis, his mentor, there. We can place Gerald Winrod, who was the kingpin of Christian identity. His son Gordon is the one who had the standoff in Arkansas, etc. So anyway, we've got all these threads that are all coming together. And the interesting part is all of that backstory leads to what you and I are going to be talking about today, the carrying on, passing of the torch to Hobart Freeman.
You can document, because he did go to schools, Georgetown College, Southern Baptist Seminary, Grace Theological Seminary in Winona Lake. Thankfully, that can be documented. And of course, the other thing, John, is you're going back so much earlier in the 1900s with William Branham than we have to go with Hobart Freeman. But I think where I kind of left off last time, and we'll see how far we get this time, that, he had been dismissed by Grace Theological Seminary for, we get two sides to the story. You have Grace's side, and I think Dr. Homer Kent might have been the president of Grace Seminary at that time. I'm not exactly for sure. But Grace Seminary was, and is today, it is still in Winona Lake. It's a very prominent Brethren seminary. There have been illustrious professors there from the past, people like Dr. John Whitcomb, who co-authored with Henry Morris the classic book, The Genesis Flood, which came out in maybe the early 1960s. Teaching that the Genesis account is a new earth, not an old earth account, and that the flood was universal. And so there were, some notable professors who have come from there. They say that because they've been interviewed, that Hobart was fired because he was not compliant with, seminary policy. And Hobart says he was fired because his wife would not attend a Christmas party that faculty members and their wives were supposed to attend. And he, by that time, no longer believed in celebrating Christmas or any of the other holidays. But for whatever reason, he was dismissed and began a church in his house in Claypool, Indiana in 1963. They rattled around for a while. He received the baptism in the Holy Spirit in 1966. The church began to grow a little bit, but it was really after the turn of the 1970s, they had moved over to a 3-car garage on Barbie Lake that belonged to his song leader, Jerry Irvin, who remained his song leader for the entire time. I mean, from way back then to the very end. And I would imagine anybody that you will interview from this point forward from Faith Assembly will have nothing but good things to say about Jerry. Everybody loved Jerry. He was just, he was the song leader, and he was just wonderful. I've never heard a bad word about Jerry Irvin. But what changed in the early, in the early 1970s was they were running out of room in the 3-car garage. And simultaneously, there was a man named Mel Grider, who was an ex-alcoholic, ex-military, ex-biker rider, who had a barn on his property in North Webster, Indiana, and he had started up a little coffee shop to try to reach, and you got to think of these days, 1970s, this is flower power, this is hippies. You know, he was trying to reach those people, drug addicts, alcoholics, motorcycle gang members, you know, all of that. So it was the most unusual marriage you could imagine between Dr. Hobart Edward Freeman and Mel and Mary Beth Grider, who I think one of their children's names might be Early Mist, and the other one is Dawn Awakening or something like that. Those were their 2 daughters. That's the kind of people that Mel and Mary Beth were. And so you've got this joining of education and ex-motorcycle. But I mean, I think to start with, it was a marriage made in heaven or made in North Webster because Mel had the building and Hobart had the people. And so what happened was Mel didn't have the money, and because Hobart had the people, Hobart also had the money. So they joined up. And the deal was Hobart would write the checks, which he faithfully did, to remodel this barn, and turned the 2nd floor into a very, very nice meeting area. The 1st floor was reserved for Mel and his coffee shop and, you know, that kind of outreach that he intended to do. You walk up the steps on the outside and go in the building, then you were on the 2nd floor. And at the very back of the 2nd floor were more steps inside that went up to a 3rd floor. And that's where the Griders lived. Because I can remember when the first time I attended, and I've got this picture, you know, that you can put up and see. This was August, the middle of August of 1976. And you can see here, just look at the style of these automobiles in the parking lot, and you can definitely date the time. It was a mid-1970s. And over on the far left side of the picture, you can see the steps that lead up, and you can see people, you know, going in. Well, yeah. The way we got there is my friends who had I lived in Memphis, Tennessee at the time. My young teenage friends had gone to a Howard Johnson motel, and had sat in on a weekend conference that Freeman had in the spring of 76 there, brought some tapes back. We all thought, this is better than anything in the charismatic movement that we've been listening heretofore, so we're going to follow this and see where it goes. Well, by the end of that summer, you know, we were listening to a fair number of tapes. I'm 17 years old, remember, at the time. And so my friends had an aunt who lived in Niles, Michigan. And so their mom, the aunt's sister, was going to make a trip. And we figured out, well, North Webster, Indiana is not far from Niles, Michigan. I wonder if your mom, if we go visit you guys' aunt, if your mom will let us borrow the car as teenagers and we'll drive back down. That's exactly what we did. I got great memories of going to Southern Michigan in August of 1976. And they were meeting in the barn by that time. And when we went in the barn, we didn't know you have to get there 4 hours early to get a seat. We didn't realize that. We were newbies. So when we got to that second floor, there was nowhere to sit. So we climbed those steps at the back going up to, we didn't know that anybody lived in there. We're sitting at the top of those steps in the back of the barn and watched the service. The message that morning was entitled, Our Family Physician. He was teaching on divine healing. And then we came back that night and he was teaching on faith or presumption, the Logos Rhema error that he felt was being propagated by Kenneth Hagin out in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But anyway, back to 72, Mel had the building. Hobart began writing the checks. They began remodeling that building, turning it into something pretty nice for them to actually have the meeting there. And I think that maybe maximum they might have had, I don't know, maybe 400 people, but it was a little bit unsafe with that many people in a charismatic, mind you, worship service where people don't sit still. and they're in a barn and they're on the second floor of the barn. And so that was my introduction to the Glory Barn and, how it came about with the alliance of Mel Grider and Hobart Freeman.
You brought back so many memories and strange emotions. I have actually been in services like this where you're standing and you're the whole building is packed. There's not a single seat in it, and you are violating so many building codes because the people just lined up around the walls.
If they had any codes,
if they had any codes, right? And I have heard specifically sermons about the Rhema while standing in this thing, not knowing that this is Kenneth Hagin word of faith stuff, and when you follow it back to its roots, it's really started with Dowieism, and through Dowie, through Bosworth, through Branham to Kenneth Hagin and so forth. You may have seen this. I don't know if you knew, but as late as I think the government document I've got on my site is 1982, maybe. I've got a corporation that was created by Kenneth Hagin, T.L. Osborne, the William Branham Association, the Voice of God Recordings, which is the other William Branham Association, and one Branham cult pastor out west. So all these guys are financially connected, strategically connected, doctrinally connected. And what's funny is, I almost interrupted you. You mentioned the hippie era, which was slightly before my time, but we had a podcast interview, and this guy he had escaped the Moses David Berg cult.
Yes, and Children of God.
Children of God. I interviewed him, and I was like, well, why are you talking to me about, this is a Branham site? And that was back before it had kind of spun off to, there's so many splinter groups, you can't even count them all. Well, during the course of our conversation, he says, and if you go to this website, you'll find all of David Berg's praise of William Branham for helping him start his ministry. And I said, what in the world? I go back and look, and David Berg was he was ousted for what appears to be sexual misconduct. And, in the latter rain, you would pray over somebody, and that would impart your spiritual gift to them, and they become a latter rain prophet or whatever. Well, apparently William Branham did this to Moses David Berg, who started the cult of the flirty fishers that had prostitutes
I had
for
heard
Jesus.
that.
Unbelievable, yes. Man.
So evidently, before there was an internet, there was a World Wide Web. And that's all of these people connected, I guess, all the way back to Zion City and John Alexander Dowie days. And I mean, there are so many connections between all of these people. Well, so they continued there in the barn, 72, 73. In 1974, Hobart started what they call the Charismatic School. and again, I want to give him props for this. He was really trying to theologically, biblically educate the people. They taught an Old Testament survey class, a New Testament survey class, biblical theology, some church history, archaeology. They did a class in Hebrew. I mean, this wasn't what you see online today of just pop sermons and just mysticism. I mean, they were really going a little bit deeper into their studies. And they did that 74, 75. And then in 1976, this was the last year that Hobart stopped his traveling ministry, where he was leaving Faith Assembly, the Glory Barn at the time, to take outside speaking engagements. All up until this time, at least once a month, he was gone out of town, out of state, in some speaking engagement. It would be one of his own that he would set up later on. Early on, it would be at a Full Gospel Businessmen's meeting, or, a Lutheran church whose pastor had become charismatic and invited Hobart to speak. He had all kinds of meetings like that. And that continued in the 60s, late 60s, and up through the first 6 or 7 years of the 1970s. But by 1976, that was the last year that he took those outside speaking engagements. And I think there are probably several reasons why. I think the number one reason, Hobart's message had begun to ever so slightly shift, and he was just fed up with what he perceived to be compromise in the rest of the charismatic movement, compromise or error and heresy. He just didn't think anybody was going far enough. He felt that he had the end time message, the faith message, the matured, manifested sons of God. They were part of the latter rain. I remember him talking about this rain business all the time. And Joel talks about it in Joel 2. Hosea has some verses about it, the former rain, the latter rain. But the charismatic interpretation of that always was the former rain was somewhere around the early 1900s and Azusa Street. Amy Semple McPherson and Charles Parham and William Seymour and all those people, and that this, post outpouring of the Holy Spirit on those students at Notre Dame in 1967, this is like the latter rain movement. And that was happening at Notre Dame with people like Father Kevin Ranahan, and Hobart actually spoke to that group and knew Kevin Ranahan. But they were feeling we are a part of the latter rain, and the latter rain is going to be poured out immediately prior to the second advent. And so every year, well, this is the last year. And then the next year, well, this is the last year. And then the next year, well, if this isn't the last year, it will be the last year. And, here we are. I'm 50 years removed from Hobart saying it'll be next year or the next year. Now, they wouldn't predict a date. They were too smart to do that. But they would say all the signs are pointing to the fact that we don't have really any time left. The last days are upon us and we're in it. And my goodness, John, when you're 17 and 18 years old and you hear that, I mean, I don't want to be left behind. I don't want to disappoint God. I want to be a part of everything God has planned for me and for the church. If he's going to manifest his sons, well, I want to be manifested.
Yeah.
I don't want to be left out. Please include me. So, as I said earlier, when you're young, you don't have the ability to critically think and, connect all the dots. And when I look back, I don't beat myself up for that one iota. I was living a great, happy Christian life as I am today. I'm just living a smarter Christian life than I was back. But I don't want to have any less zeal or enthusiasm, whether the second coming is tomorrow or 50 years from now. I want to keep my zeal and enthusiasm high. But Hobart was very unhappy with what he saw was compromise. He if you listen to his messages, hundreds of occasions, he basically would divide Christianity up into three different groups of people. They would be the people who just got saved, and that's all they did. Then the people who got the baptism in the Holy Spirit, and then the people who wanted to go on and become an overcomer. And so he would just talk nonstop about those people who just stopped with John 3:16, the salvation experience. And it was almost like an afterthought to him. And I know what the purpose was. The purpose was to, elicit this superiority feeling that he wanted everyone to have. We're not just like those people. We're not going to stop with salvation. We're not going to camp out at Pentecost. We're going to go on to the deeper things of God. That's what he's trying to create in people. But in looking back on it, John, it's the worst thing you could communicate, in my mind, as a Christian pastor and teacher, to try to tell people that your John 3:16 experience, all you are is a Christian. That's all you are. That is somehow marginalized or minimalized. There's nothing greater that can happen in our life than to be converted to Christianity, born again, and serve the Lord. There's nothing greater. And he thought that was just the first step. And you have to have that to go further, but we don't want to talk about just those nominal people, those people that stopped with John 3:16. We want to go, and we don't want to talk about and be with those people that stopped with Acts 2, the baptism of the Holy Spirit. He began elevating Faith Assembly, himself and his group, to the putting down of anybody that doesn't reach our level. And those that didn't reach their level, quote unquote, were Christians.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. My salvation experience, John, is the greatest thing that's ever happened to me. Nothing can compare to that. You can't trade that for anything, and you certainly can't put that down and minimalize that as they did. But I would bet that's probably what most of these groups do. That's all in the past, and we're wanting to elevate ourselves to something higher.
Oh, yeah. I've often wondered after leaving, and I was 37 years old in a new church the first time that I ever actually heard the gospel. I grew up in all these churches, and they would use the word gospel, but I never actually heard it. And
wow.
I'll never forget this was a Baptist church, and the Baptist pastor asked me, "What is the gospel?" Well, the answer I gave him was not even close to what is the gospel. And I was expecting some complicated, intricate strategy of power and healing and glory. And
yes.
And when he explained it, I scratched my head. Wait a minute, really? And so I go back, I read the Bible, I want to say like 10, 15 times after I left. And I was going through it one time, and I started again, this time at the New Testament. I just started reading through it. I'm like, wait a minute. It's that, and it's that simple. Why would they try to confuse this? And so then the question came to me, well, why did they not teach the gospel? And I started going back through my memory of some of the doctrines and theologies and, some of the ways that they would phrase what they were teaching. And they would say things like, we had this, and they would be referring to the gospel. We had this. Now, as Christians, we have to move beyond this. So in other words, here's the gospel. We have to move beyond it. And it wasn't until maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I came to realize it's all because of this Christian identity, this manifest sons of God form of Christian identity, because you're trying to create this man-child experience. You're trying to create a people who are more elite than all of the other Christians, because
Definitely.
You, as the manifested sons, are going to issue human judgment against other Christians. And that is, when you really think about what's happening, that is horrific what they're doing.
And I hope in a later broadcast, if we do this again, I'm going to give you some exact quotes, and we can timestamp those on the tapes for what you're talking about right there. And looking back, on the people that I knew at Faith Assembly, and I hate to make a, paint with too broad of a brush or make too general of a statement, but it does seem to me that there weren't a lot of medical doctors or attorneys or professors that were a part of the church. And what I mean by that is this message of health and wealth gospel, which Hobart 110% preached and believed, that God wants everyone to prosper. And I mean, just sermon after sermon after sermon, and making light of things like, well, you people do realize that cows are made out of more than hamburger. When you're telling that to, people in their 20s that are day laborers that, don't have a big income, they're looking up to these ministers, we don't eat we eat steak because, our God is bigger, and they're better cuts of meat that come off. And that is obviously not the gospel. That is not what the gospel is about at all. If we read our New Testament, we read our Old Testament for the Lord's sake carefully. The prophets suffered. Jesus said, the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head. Paul was beaten. Paul was shipwrecked. They went through difficulty and extreme measures of persecution to preach their gospel. And the prosperity gospel preachers today don't do that at all. But I think it attracted just a less educated, I'm not going to say a lower level of society, because it doesn't matter where in society you come from. But if you are less educated, if you do have less income, if you do have fewer resources to call upon, and you are being presented a message that you never have to go to the doctor, that borrowing money is a sin, Romans 13:8. You don't ever have to borrow money. All you have to do is name it and claim it. God will give it to you. If you need a new car, if you need a new apartment, a bigger apartment, a new house, a bigger house, new clothes, whatever. Well, I mean, that's very appealing. It very much is appealing to people who may not have any other way to obtain that level of success. Where most of us, you have to just go out and work, and you earn it. That's how you get it. And I just thought it was so hypocritical of these ministers who had a large following. If you got a large following, guess what? That it comes with a large offering. If you're a pastor of 10 people, guess what? You got a small offering, that's
you get a whole salary, right? Because they tithe you 10%. So 10 people is an entire salary for these guys. Yes. And the ministers that would go out from Faith Assembly who could not fight their way out of a wet bag theologically, they were a pale comparison to Hobart's educational level and his ability to communicate a message. They're going out to their little satellite groups. Now they've attracted, 200, 250 people. There was one in Indianapolis. There was one on the campus of Purdue University called the Lighthouse up in West Lafayette. They had, several hundred people. These ministers in their nice 3-piece suits strode in there, like in my Cadillac Lincoln Town Car. I'm preaching this. I believe it. I practice what I preach, and here's a proof of it. And let me share it with you guys. Well, these are college students. They don't have the income to do that. But these nutcase ministers thought it was their faith in God, quote unquote, that was giving them all of this financial abundance. And it wasn't. It was just you had a large congregation. And that's how that came about. But I just felt so sorry for the people that were sucked into that. Oh, yeah. I've also come to the conclusion that it is actually more appealing to the men who see the dollar signs in their eyes and want to become a pastor. Because if you can take something as simple as the gospel and complicate it where nobody can understand it, so they have to come to you for the answer of what is this thing. Think of the difference between that and what we read in the Bible, where Jesus is taking very, very simple people, fishermen, who aren't very, maybe they're intelligent, but they're not schooled, obviously. Yes. And they're taking something so simple and it spreads organically. They can tell it to another person. That person can tell it to another person. Everybody can share it. It's so simple. Everybody can share it. Well, they complicate it so they can become the kingpin of their church.
Yes. The years when I was a pastor, I was never a pastor of a large group of people, but it was a decent group of people. And I never took up an offering, had a box in the back, and what went in it came to me. And if nothing went in it, nothing came to me. And I've never been hesitant to tell people my biggest year of income was $20,000. That was the most I ever made in a year, was $20,000. But, I didn't care. I was doing exactly what I felt called to do. I was loving every minute of it. I loved serving the Lord. I loved my people. I just couldn't believe that I was that privileged to get to be in ministry full time. I didn't have any kind of side gig or part-time job. And I just couldn't believe that I got to spend all of my time, in and around God's word. So to get paid $20,000 to do it, that's a windfall as far as I was concerned.
Yeah.
And now, whenever I got out of the ministry because of personal situations with an ex-wife of mine, then I, went into the regular workforce. But I established a couple of businesses, both of which I still do. I own a high-end custom cabinet company that I have for over 30 years. I'm also a licensed professional fishing guide with a master captain's license in the Coast Guard. And I've taken people like Coach Denny Crum, who coached the Louisville basketball team, and Buddy Ryan, who was the NFL coach of the Eagles. I've had all kinds of people on my boat over the years and have had a lot of fun doing that. But, I've gone out and made my own way, become very, very successful. And I'm so thankful for that as well. I'm teaching a group down in Bowling Green, but I won't accept any money. I said, I'm just here to teach. You can give your money to somebody else. And I just think it puts a minister in such a good position when there is no one can accuse you of any other. They could accuse you of ulterior motives, but not financial ulterior motives, because there are no finances involved. And you and I know that's just been a huge downside to all of these big time public ministries. Oh my goodness, the money, the mansions, the cars, the villas, the trips, the airplanes, the private jets. That is just such a disgrace to Christianity. And of course, they'll have verses they use to prove it, but you can prove anything you want to prove from the Bible. But if you take the overall thread and the overall tenet of it, to get financially rich in this world, that's not what the gospel is about, not what it's about at all. And of course, you can lift verses out of context and, as I say, prove anything you want. But, I can't even... I look back on my early years in ministry, and I'm very thankful for them. But having lived on both sides of it now, where I'm still sure I don't receive any income from any kind of ministerial stuff. I am very, very well off in my own life, but I went and did it on my own. I made my own business. I worked extremely hard. I really understand both sides of the pulpit now. I understand being behind it and being in front of it. And I don't think that I ever misused or abused my position before. I'm not aware of it. And I'm glad I can look back on that and say, yeah, Chino, I'm happy with you. I'm happy with you back in your 20s. I would feel terrible if I looked back and saw myself as one of these prosperity ministers and had gotten rich on the backs of other people who are working hard and who never could get to my level because I have so many of them providing for me and they only have themselves providing for themselves. I look back on that. I have fond memories, but I am so thankful that I've gotten to experience the other side and go out. Because what I'd like to tell a lot of these ministers is you need to go get a real job. you really need to quit preaching. You don't know what you're talking about. You're fleecing the sheep. You really need to get out of that context and go get a real job and see what it means to work hard, like all those poor people, under your ministry are having to do. And think of these international ministries that have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of followers and supporters. It's a scam of the first order as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. That same church that I was mentioning, they, I think we may have discussed this in the last episode. I was shocked the first time they gave me the financial report, because right down to the toilet paper, man, you can see where all the money was going. And I want to say it was maybe $50,000 a year the pastor made, which if you do the math and inflation, that's about like your $20,000 probably. It's not much money in today's world. And, I was thinking back, it's just so different. I have also seen both sides of it. I've never been a pastor. I've always been a lay member, but I've been around people who were in the upper echelons, and I can see the things that they do to make money, some of which is really underhanded. I have firsthand knowledge of men who they really like to attract the old elderly women to their little groups, because whenever they die, they get their inheritance.
Yes.
And it's terrible to think that they did. There are children of some of these people. They're not getting anything because all of it's going to the pastor. And the first time, I'm a businessman. I know how business, sales, marketing, all of this works. Not everybody does. But when you consider what it took back during the height of latter rain to pull off one of these big conventions, it took a lot of money to make money. You've got to rent the auditorium, you've got the advertising expenses, you've got everything down to the hot dog stands. And, back then it wasn't like today where these concession booths exist. Sometimes you had to bring in food to keep the people fed while they're in there. And you've got all of this going on. Well, before they can even hold this meeting, they've got to have millions of dollars back then to even set the thing up. So,
wow.
When I took a step back from all of this, and I learned that I'm not a big fan of the big mega churches at all. And
me neither.
No. There are some good men in them, but when you get to that level, you have to run it like a business. And once you enter the business concept in, well, where's the gospel concept? Sometimes not even intentionally, the business just overtakes the whole reason why you're doing it.
Yeah, sometimes compromise happens, and we know where the compromise will come down. It'll be on the teaching of the word and not on the finances, because if you don't have the finances, you can't keep running the big machine that you got to keep running. No, I'm a big opponent of mega churches. I think they just violate so many scriptural concepts and precepts. But getting back to Dr. Freeman, so in 1976, he had... that was the end of his traveling. I think another one of the reasons that he stopped traveling, and I just alluded to this briefly in our earlier one, is that he did, when he was 2 years old, he contracted polio. This was he was born in 1920, so he's a Depression era child, and he had a severe limp, and it was very noticeable. Well, here you have a faith preacher praying for everyone's legs to be grown out. That was the big thing back in the early 1970s. You'd sit a person in a chair, get them straight up and down on the back of a hard chair, get them, about this, get them to lift the left and the right, and you hold them in your hands like this. So that was a big, big deal. I don't know.
It's a magician's trick. I
don't see it going on today.
No, everybody knows how it works. It's a magician's trick. Everybody knows how it works. You set them with one leg slightly cocked with their one butt cheek back behind, and then in front of the audience, look at this leg grow as they twist the torso. My grandfather... Well, I'll never forget, I was sitting in the church and my grandfather said, I watched case after case after case. And my grandfather had this Kentucky accent where Brother Branham would take the leg and he would straighten that leg and you would watch it grow with your own eyes. And I saw a video of this guy doing it, and I saw a video of a magician showing how it worked. And I'm like, I can't believe I was in my 30s and I fell for this, man.
Yeah. Well, it was a big deal back in the 70s. And so, here you've got a major faith teacher traveling around teaching healing, and he's got a bad limp. And so he talks about that on a lot of his tapes, that people in meetings would say, basically, physician, heal thyself. And I think it became an annoyance to him. He never said this. This is my own take on one of the contributing factors for him to stop all of the traveling. Every meeting he's going to, he's limping in like this, and then he's preaching faith for healing. And then he's having everybody come up wanting him to sit down, and they say, well, pray for your leg to grow out for you. I think he had probably had enough of that. So, he said, I'm just going to stay at Faith Assembly at the Glory Barn. We've got the school going now. He was plenty busy. He also began doing radio broadcasts. So he'd spend a week getting tapes ready to send to stations. I don't know. There are probably several dozen. And that was probably pretty big for him back in the day, back in the mid 70s. But he was definitely on a variety of radio stations. So from 76, 77, by the time we get to 1978, as every one of these movements has its own progression, they just generally become tighter and tighter and tighter, rather than becoming more loving and more mature, and which should come with Christian growth and experience. But in these groups, it doesn't seem to work that way. It seems to, be a funnel, and you're all headed down to the bottom end, and it's just getting tighter and tighter. And so Mary Beth and Mel Grider, who were the owners of the barn, said that they were unhappy with the way the teaching, the direction that the church was going. They were unhappy in how exclusive it was becoming, because keep in mind, Mel was ministering to drug addicts and alcoholics and everybody downstairs. And then one floor up, you've got Hobart, teaching Gideon's army. There's only going to be 300 of us. Everybody else is going to be ruled out. So it was not going to be a good mix between the two. And the other thing was the issue of divine healing, where previously Hobart would teach divine healing, but he wouldn't legislate against medical science or doctors. He would just say, well, if you don't have enough faith like the rest of us do, then you can go to the doctor. But if you have enough faith, you don't need the doctor. Well, as he progressed, it became more than that you must have enough faith. You have to. That's required. If you don't, maybe a sign you're not a Christian. So now they're just pretty much cutting everybody off, except themselves. You got to follow us exactly. Hobart, on several of the tapes, talks about, well, tomorrow I've got to go take my vision test for my driver's license, and I'm just claiming 20/20. Well, he never had 20/20. He was in his 50s, He never did wear glasses, but at the end, he's got up on the pulpit a giant print Bible. So, me and my simple, uneducated, tiny mind would say, what's the difference between a pair of glasses and a giant print Bible? What is the difference? If you really have X-ray vision, let's just go to microscopic print then. If you really want to prove your faith, let's prove it. Give me a demonstration of it. So I just thought, and obviously Mel and Mary Beth said, this, we don't like where we think this is going to end up. And where it ends up, we won't get to it in our discussion today, but it's just dozens and scores of preventable deaths. They realized that something not good is going to come from this. So they decided we're going to start charging rent. Prior to that had been a rent-free place. Hobart had poured a bunch of money from the offerings, his money from the church, into remodeling the place. And the building didn't belong to him. That belonged to the Griders. So, they had this building nicely remodeled, new air conditioning, men's and women's bathrooms. They have all this stuff in there, which I think is a fair trade-off. They got all that, and Hobart got the use of it for the years that they did. But now they said, we're going to start charging rent. $425 a week, I believe is what they said. And they had Hobart over to their apartment to discuss this. And 4-hour meeting, from what I have heard, a 4-hour meeting back and forth, them complaining about the direction the teaching's going, and Hobart saying, I'm God's prophet, quote unquote. This is the message. This is what I'm going to teach.
God's prophet, give it to me free.
Yes. Yeah. So you end up basically with a stalemate. And so I think at that point, and probably Mel and Mary Beth, although I'm not an insider into their life or mine, they probably had decided before, if we can't get somewhere in this discussion, we're gonna stick a big figure out there that'll probably run him off. And that's exactly what it did. They said $425 a week, $2,000 a month in 1978. That's not that much money with a 500 member church. $2,000 a month isn't that much, but Hobart in his next message said that's extortion and we're out of here. So early 1978 was the formal break between Hobart Freeman and Mel and Mary Beth Grider. So the Glory Barn would stay as is. It would still be the building, and then they were going to leave. Well, where do they go? They don't have anywhere to go. So it was a circus environment because they got a big circus tent. They set it up in Warsaw, and then it ended up in Goshen. And he's got lots of messages, because the land of Goshen is down there in Egypt in the Old Testament, and that's a bad place with unregenerate people. So there are lots of references on you can tell the tapes that are happening in the tent in the summer of 1978 when he makes reference to the terrible people in Goshen, because you're thinking he means Egypt, but really he means Indiana. So they stay in that tent for, it wasn't very long. They had a trailer parked there with a lot of porta potties because, these people are producing lots of offspring. They don't believe in birth control. They're homeschooled. The women don't hold a job. The women are at home. The men go earn a living. The families are big. The couples are producing a lot of children. There's a need for a lot of porta potties out there. So they go through 78, and they had a couple by the name of Don and Betty Nye, N-E-I, who had donated some property there in Wilmot, W-I-L-M-O-T, which is where they ended up. They had donated some property, and so they began building the building. And the building is just a big, pole barn kind of building, metal building, single story, concrete slab, drab, which I have no problem with that. You don't need steeples and stained glass. Spend your money in missions or something. Don't spend it on your own building. I'm fine with the building they built, but people look down on it because it looked like some industrial warehouse. Again, I have no criticism of that whatsoever. On the inside, it was comfortable, concrete slab, little small platform up front, and then the podium on that. And just, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of chairs everywhere, and lots of men's and women's restrooms in the back. And they had the tape ministry duplication area and the book distribution center attached to the building. Over the process of a few months, there were people who were a part of Faith Assembly. Now we can't call them the Glory Barn anymore because that's in their history. That was the actual building. Now they're just the name of the church, Faith Assembly. But people from Ohio, Illinois, contractors who had some construction equipment, maybe a concrete contractor, maybe plumbers in the church, pitched in, and they got that building thrown up quickly. When they first moved in, I think they moved in that winter time. I don't know that they had heat, but you get 1,500 people in there and you just generate your own heat. But things came together pretty quickly after that. But the big deal was whenever they made the move, before they made the move to the new building, when they were in what I call the transition in the tent, then the messages began. Now we're not in someone else's building. This is going to be our own building. No one can tell me to come or go. No one can tell me what to say or what not to say. This isn't a rented facility, or this isn't a borrowed facility. This is our own. In that transition period in the tent in Goshen, now the message became, you're going to have to line up with everything this pulpit stands for. And if you don't, you will be out the door. And if you're out the door, there's 6 people waiting to get your seat. I mean, it was never, we're going to miss you or anything. It's get out. There's 6 people waiting for your seat. And they were proud of that statement. Like, we have so many people that want to be here. If you don't count it as much of a privilege to get to attend here as you should, then just leave and someone else will take your seat. And again, John, more than anything, it's the attitude of someone like this that is atrocious when you compare it with the loving, kind, and generous spirit of the early church, of the apostles, and who were apostles after all, and had all the authority from heaven, but they just loved the people and sacrificed to the point of death on behalf of the spread of the Christian gospel. And I don't see this reflected in Hobart Freeman's ministry one iota. Now, he'll talk like, oh, you really mean a lot, and I pray for you. Yeah, but show it to me. You know, you got to show it to the people. And you standing up there preaching your sermons, that's not what shows it. It's in your love. Well, he wouldn't counsel with anybody. He was, if you can't get it in the message, then what good would counseling do? I mean, he said that countless times. I'm counseling by teaching all of you people. And if you can't pick it up here, I'd be wasting my time to sit down and privately, one-on-one, explain to you what I've just taught you for an hour and 10 minutes from the pulpit. So from that point on, the bodyguards, the spies, the lookouts, maybe some people resurrected from their SS Nazi graves hanging around to keep an eye on no outsiders allowed in here. This is Gideon's army. We are the matured sons of God, and we're going all the way.
Yeah, I have some very painful memories of people who were very, very poor, who needed help. They couldn't keep food on their table. And these guys who were driving fancy cars, living in nice houses, boats, houseboats, etc., and they're making all this money on the people. And remember, these guys are pushing Old Covenant tithe in many of these churches. Old Covenant tithe is the 10%, and they spin it in such a way where you're going to hell if you don't give this 10%, right?
Right.
Well, under the Old Covenant, the priest got, the 10%, but then at the end of his life, or I think it was the year of the Jubilee, he gave back everything to the people except for what it took him to live the rest of his life. So these people are actually getting it back. And these people in this movement, man, they're taking the money. They love the part where you give it to them. They don't want to preach the part where you give it back.
Yeah, let me share 2 comments that come to mind regarding that. One is me personally, John. When I was 17, 18 years old, I'm hearing about prosperity. Hobart always drove an Eldorado Cadillac, but then when he began traveling so much, needing to carry tapes and books to sell at the tables at his meetings, he said that the trunk on a Lincoln Town Car was bigger, so then he switched to Lincoln Town Cars. So in my early life, I grew up thinking that's what I'm supposed to drive. So guess what? About the second or third year of my ministry, I had saved and scraped together, and I went and bought I paid $10,000 for it, which was a lot of money back then, a used Lincoln Town Car. I kept it for 4 months, and I felt so terrible driving that to church. I felt horrible. I was so embarrassed to pull up into the church parking lot in my Lincoln Town Car and seeing what everybody else was driving. I took that back to the dealer. I traded it in on a Jeep Wagoneer that had 70,000 miles and 4 ball tires on it. And I was happy as a clam because I thought, I fit in with my people better. But as far as Hobart was concerned, Hobart actually taught strongly against tithing. He said a 10% tithe is legalism. It's tied to the Old Testament law. and tithing was done away with at the cross, and tithing is not for a New Testament believer. Rather, he said what the New Testament shows is that everything belongs to the Lord, that all of your possessions belong to the Lord. And so I would try to think, well, what goes through the minds of those people hearing that?
Wow.
How much of all am I supposed to give? Obviously, a lot more than 10%.
Wow. That is so crazy. It may have been you. I know I told it to somebody recently. My grandfather, who wasn't the pastor, he was in a message cult church, and they tried to do the same kind of thing. They said, the Bible says you should give all that you have to the poor, and therefore put it in the tithe basket, was the doctrine, you know. And my grandfather approached him and he said, well, look, man, if I give all that I have to you in the tithe basket, then I become the poor. So he was putting on his critical thinking cap. But
yeah.
Thank you so much for doing this, and we'll do this again. I know there's more to the story. I think we're only about halfway through it. So thanks again for coming on here.
Thank you, John. I know we probably went a little long today. I'll try to get you some stuff emailed that you can put in this picture or in this broadcast, maybe that Glory Bond picture and a picture of the Wilmot building that they built. But I think next time when we really can talk about what Hobart's death, what led up to it, what's going on around that time, and then his actual death. And I can reference these newspaper articles. You can have already found them and do whatever you want to do with them. Does that sound okay to you?
Sounds good. And I'm sure our listeners are going to be anxious to hear that one. So if you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For an overview of the historical research of William Branham and the Healing Revivals, read Preacher Behind the White Hoods, a critical examination of William Branham and his message, available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.